Thanks everybody for coming today. Wanted to talk to you all about Angular 2. I've had a lot of questions both on social media and then private questions and then at conferences, through email about what state is Angular 2 in right now and when should we start using it and how do we compare this to other technologies that are out there. So hopefully today gives you kind of a sense for both how do you look at Angular 2 and then also how do you use Angular 2. So to start things off, if you want to reach me, you can reach me on Twitter at John_Papa, or you can check me out on my blog at johnpapa.net. I answer from both those places. If you're looking for a little deeper understanding of Angular 2 and learning how to code with it, you can watch my course on Pluralsight using this link right here. It actually walks you through creating Angular 2 application. If you've got Angular 1 experience, great. That'll work for you. There's a few parts in there that'll help you. If you don't have Angular 1 experience, that's fine too. So today, what I wanted to talk about was three specific areas. One is why Angular 2, and then kind of show some of the code you can do with Angular 2. We won't be showing a live demo because of technical difficulties, but I'll be showing you the code that you can use. And then also talk about the developer experience. So first, why Angular 2? And before you get into any technology, people talk all the time about, hey, there's this awesome new cool thing that's coming out, and everybody's using it. Well, why are they using it? Well, because it's cool. Well, why is it cool? You really should ask why anytime somebody says there's a new shiny object out there. Because not everything that's shiny is something you really should invest in. Is it something that's stable? Is there a lot of community support? What about the ecosystem around it? How am I going to deploy it? Is there a testing environment? What is it? Is it easy to get going with? So there's a lot of questions you should ask yourself. So let's take a look at some of the top things about Angular 2. First of all, when you're doing Angular 2, and that's not showing up. Let's check this out. So having a little slide difficulty here.
John, if you hit advance over, it should actually work for you. Hit the advance button.
All right, I got it there now. Cool. So the first thing about Angular 2 is super fast. In Angular 1, there were a lot of issues with something called the digest cycle, where basically it managed change detection. And there were a lot of rules about how many things you could put on a page to actually handle that. Well, in Angular 2, they got rid of the entire digest cycle. And they did a bunch of other things to make it super fast. It's an order of magnitude faster than Angular 1. And some of that is with rewriting the application. But it's also because when they wrote Angular 1 almost 6 years ago, a lot was different in the web world. When you think about it, think about what phone you had in your pocket 6 years ago. Did you even have a smartphone then? Some people didn't. So a lot of things have changed in the technology. And Angular 2 basically said, you know what, things have changed so much, we're going to rewrite this to be super fast. Second thing is it's really powerful. Because of the speed, you get a lot more power out of it. But it also runs faster, so you can do more things. And there's more things you can talk to with Angular 2. So you can actually talk with mobile, or you can talk with other devices. You can actually run Angular on a desktop as well. And we'll look a little bit at that. It's also very clean. The code we had to write in Angular 1, there was a lot of JavaScript code that was been around for 10 plus years with different patterns using ES5. And now we can use things like ES6, in the future ES7, or ES 2016, ES 2017, or even use TypeScript. And the code that we write with those, it's not that it's a different language, it's that it's cleaner. There's a lot less, different things you have to do. Like there were concepts like IFEs, immediately invoked function executions or expressions. Things like that we had to do in ES5, and in Angular 2 we don't have to do that. There's also a lot more ways that you can write strongly typed code with Angular 2 that makes it easier to write better code with less problems in production. And quite frankly, I think it's easier. Writing Angular 2, there's less things you have to learn. In some cases, there's actually 40 things that went away in some of the years, and we'll take a look at that. You think how cool that is. There's only so much room in your brain for learning things. So when you can eliminate things out of your brain that you don't have to remember, it makes it much easier to learn. Now, what about the browser you support at work? Well, the good news is it supports any modern browser, mobile or desktop, and it even goes back to, yes, IE9. Now, do we all enjoy IE9? No, but you can use IE9 with Angular 2. So if you're looking at which browser will it support, you can go all the way back to IE9. And the question might come up of, well, if I'm using ES6 or TypeScript to write Angular 2, can I use IE9 still? Because those browsers don't support that. Well, yes, you can, because when you use TypeScript or ES6, you're going to use a process to transpile the code So it does get supported on IE9. So absolutely, you can use that, and there are no issues there. Now, who's using it? Well, there's this little company called Google, and they make a little bit of money out of a product called AdWords. And they're actually one of the early testers, the dog fooders, of Angular 2. They've got tons of lines of code here writing an Angular 2 application that they base a lot of the business off. And they also have some internal applications they're using. And then recently at NGConf, the largest Angular conference, which was 2 weeks ago, the Google team announced several other companies that I'm not at liberty to say which they are, but you can go watch them on YouTube, that they actually came up on stage and talked about what they've done with Angular 2 so far. And you'll recognize many of those names that are already invested in it. So what about the size of Angular 2? It's often been talked about, it's really big, it's really slow, and early in the alpha process, and they're now at release candidate, it was problematic because it was like 1 gig. And recently in Angular 2 beta, Angular 2 was 170K. That's not all that big, but it's big enough to give you a little bit of pause and say, what's that going to be like maybe on a mobile device? Or what's that going to be like for my main page loading up my application? Well, Angular 1, to give you a little perspective, was 54K. So that's significantly smaller than what Angular 2 is. And you might be thinking, well, John, you just told me a lot of things went away in Angular 2, so why is it bigger? Well, part of it was they hadn't taken the time yet to optimize it. So what they announced 2 weeks ago is that Angular 2, after they've optimized it, is now actually 45K. So it's gotten down considerably, and it's actually smaller than Angular 1. So that's pretty significant, and that opens the doors to a lot of things, and the team is not done optimizing it. They actually have very lofty goals to get that to 10K. I'm not sure how they're going to do that, but let's look forward to seeing that. That'd be awesome. And that's hugely important when you're talking about mobile devices. So speaking of mobile, there are 3 really popular ways you can write mobile apps today. You can use React Native, you can use NativeScript, you can use Ionic 2. And there are different kinds of platforms. Ionic 2 is for building hybrid-based apps with Angular 2, where you're actually loading a native app up and using a web view to host Angular 2. Now that gives you great flexibility because if you're building an application that you already know Angular for your desktop, and now you can build the same kind of application for your phones, and you have the same developer skills and the same process to go through. NativeScript is similar in that you still write Angular 2, but instead of getting a web view inside of a native app, like in React Native like this too, instead of getting a web view inside of a native app, you actually get a full native app running your Angular 2 code in NativeScript. So you get an app, you don't have the slowdowns of the UI, which means that when you actually load the native app, you're using native UI features. So there's no scroll problems, there's no other animation problems that you have because you're actually using iOS or Android's native UI. But the cool part is you're using that by writing JavaScript or TypeScript with Angular 2. So this whole mobile story is getting significantly better, both from a developer experience and from a performance experience, and also from the user experience. But what about desktops? Well, if you use something called Electron, you can actually create an application written in JavaScript in Angular 2 if you'd like, and load that onto your desktop. So you can have a desktop application running Angular 2. So you think about this, the perspective in the landscape is now we can write web apps with Angular 2, we can now write desktop apps with Angular 2, and we can write native mobile apps with Angular 2. So your same skill set can really be shared across all these different platforms and touch multiple users. Now, if you're not familiar with Electron, you can check out this link here, but Electron is the basis of Visual Studio Code. So if you ever use Visual Studio Code, which runs on a Mac, Linux, or Windows, it is actually written with Electron, and it uses Node and it uses it uses Node and TypeScript to actually run everything. And we can actually write our own apps on Electron as well. And that's great if you want to have a full desktop experience. Okay, so what about UI controls? There's a great demo you can check out here at puppylovefirebaseapp.com. The Angular Material team has put tons of time into these UI components that you can use now to build your Angular applications. And they've got some basic controls out there right now, and they're constantly putting new ones out. I think right now their cadence has been about once a month. They release a couple more components. These are based upon the material design style. There's also third-party components. Wijmo has some. Infragistics has some. I believe Telerik's building theirs for Kendo for Angular 2 as well. And then there's also Bootstrap. So there's an Angular 2 Bootstrap set that's coming out. So there's tons of different UI components that you can use. Now, if you want to code with Angular 2, you've got 4 choices for your language. In your language choice, you can choose ES5, which is the JavaScript we've all been using for years and years, or you can use ES6, which has now been rebranded to ES 2015. More on that later. Or you can use TypeScript, which is basically, if you're familiar with Java or C#, TypeScript is basically a more modern language that's got static typing and classes and annotations in it. Or you can use Dart, which most people don't usually use Dart to do this, but you can. So what do you choose? Well, the good news is ES5 is a no-compile platform. If you use ES5, you don't do any transpilation. Everything you do will just show up in the browser as you need it. Whereas the other 3, you have to compile something. Why? Because the browsers understand ES5, all of them today. All browsers do, even the older ones. So that makes it easy for you if you don't want to transpile. But transpiling has a lot of advantages. So then we take a look at ES5 and ES6. The big difference here is that the ones on the left, ES5 and 6, have no types. The ones on the right do. Well, why are types important? Frankly, I could really care less about types in general, except one big thing. Types allow us to have tooling that helps us find mistakes early. So when I write my code, and it goes to production, and everything looks great, my unit tests are fine, my code looks good, the users have signed off on it, it goes live, and 2 in the morning, it breaks. Sometimes that happens because we passed the wrong thing to a function, and we didn't actually run over that code in some of our testing. Well, with TypeScript, if I had typing on those, it would actually tell me in the editor as I'm writing the code and say, John, you screwed up over there. And you can fix that. So the tooling support is phenomenal because you can use something like the types that they have. And it's the same kind of thing you get in modern IDEs with C# or Java. So there's a great advantage to using either TypeScript or Dart for that. So finally, if you use any of those 3 on the left, you're using JavaScript. ES5 and ES6, they are JavaScript. TypeScript is just a superset of JavaScript. What does that mean? Well, it means that ES5 is actually the basis for JavaScript, and then ES6, which has now been rebranded to ES 2015, which they're doing to show the releases for each year that it comes out. So in this last year was when ES6 came out and got ratified. This year's will be ES7 is now rebranded to ES 2016. They're going to have new features every year. And those features are always going to be a superset of last features that they had. Well, that's kind of important, but how do you keep up with that if JavaScript is going to change every year? How do you make sure your browsers support it so you can use the latest features? We never had to deal with that before because JavaScript didn't change for 5, 6, 7 years at a time. Now that it's changing yearly, we can take advantage of things like TypeScript. So TypeScript is the promise of any valid JavaScript will work in TypeScript. So all JavaScript is valid TypeScript. You can literally take your exact project today that you've written in JavaScript, can run it with the TypeScript compiler, and everything will be fine. Because TypeScript accepts all JavaScript. It just extends it with a few extra things. And those things are types to help you get the tooling. It also takes advantage of other features that are coming in future versions of JavaScript, like ES7 or ES8, or 2016, 2017. Things like async await. You can use those with TypeScript. Or maybe you want to take advantage of generics. Or maybe you want to take advantage of annotations or decorators. So TypeScript gives you the ability to say, you know what, we're going to use the latest and greatest features and still transpile down to whatever our browsers need to support, ES5, for example. So it gives you the best of both worlds. And that's the world we're living in today. We used to have to do things like jQuery to work across different browsers, but now TypeScript gives us this ability so that we can take advantage of the latest things and support all the modern browsers without having to sacrifice code quality. And think about that. That's pretty cool. So let's talk about some of the fundamentals now. We've kind of given an overview of what Angular is and how TypeScript fits in. And please continue to put your questions in Q&A. I'll save some time at the end to go through many of them. But let's look at the fundamentals. Now, there are 7 fundamentals that I like to think about with Angular 2. And I did a 20-minute presentation at ngConf where you can actually watch me live code all of these things and build an application on the fly. Definitely check that out. It's definitely nerve-wracking to do it in front of everybody live. So what do you got here? First, we have 7 different things in Angular 2. And those things are modules, components, and templates. Let's talk about that for a minute. Modules are a way for us to pull in other files and functionality in a way that the application can figure out who are my dependencies. Okay, that's a lot. So let's think about this in a different way. Have you ever built a web application with 100 files? How about 1,000 files? If you've ever done that, and you try to figure out, okay, now I have to put these script files in order in my index.html. How do you do that effectively? That's a pain. Even if you're going to bundle them and minify them and put them in one big concatenated file, you still have to figure out what order to put them in. Wouldn't it be great if the code could just figure out what order that they have to be put in by looking at the dependency tree? Well, by taking advantage of ES6 modules, which, again, new features in ECMAScript, or we use TypeScript to do it, either way, they use the same module structure. By using those, the code can actually look at it and figure out what order do I need to load these in. And that's wicked powerful. And we're using basic ES6. This is not an Angular thing. And then components. Components are the visuals of all of our application. Components are made up of code and the templates. The components themselves are the JavaScript or the TypeScript. And then the templates are our HTML. So we put those together, and those make up the visual representation of our application. And that's really the heart of Angular 2. Now we've also got these other 4 things. I mentioned dependency injection. That helps us figure out the dependency tree with the modules, but we also have to be able to inject things in our application. Meaning maybe I want to use in a different component, in 3 different components, customer service to go get customer data. And if I want to do that and I want to share it, I need to be able to say, hey, Angular, where is that service? And it should be able to say, I've got that right over here, John. I got you covered. And Angular 2 has a great dependency injection system that helps you solve that, which also leads us to services. Anytime you want to share logic, you just use a service, which is just a class in Angular 2. Data binding concepts are still here in Angular 2, albeit the syntax has changed slightly, and we'll take a look at that. And then also, we can use structural directives to help us create different DOM objects. So we've got these 7 concepts. Let's take a look at each real quick. And if you know these 7, you're going to be able to build a lot of applications. So first, modules. This is how you pull modules into your application. You say, I want to import something into my application from somewhere else. So the from happens to be a file location. So we're actually leaping into Angular's core, which is the core set of Angular, and that's going to give us things like a component or a function called onInit. So we can import things from other files. Modules are files, effectively, and we're going to extract them out. So here, we say go into Angular core, or go into Angular HTTP, and import these features. What we're really doing is on the left-hand side, we're saying extract HTTP out of this Angular HTTP module. If you've done any C#, you would have done something similar like this with a using statement. You'd say at the top of your code, I want to use this other DLL or this other class. And that's how you make references, and that's how the dependency tree gets set up. So the Angular application looks at this and says, I know what you're using, and I can determine the order to use them in. All right, so once we have modules, how do we define the components? These are going to represent the visual regions in our application. And again, they're associated with our templates, our HTML. And they're going to use something called a decorator to define metadata. So let's explore what this guy looks like. Up top here, we've got a story component. That's our class. A component is just a class, and it's got a property in it called name. Now, by convention, using a style guide that we've put together in the Angular I/O site, we suffix all components with component. This way we know that the story class is not just a story, it's the story component. And then inside of there, the name is a property that we can then data bind to inside of our template. So how do we associate this component with a template? Well, that's where we use this @component. @component is a way to tell Angular, that class right below me, I'm decorating him. That @component comes on top of a class, and you use that to say, I'm telling you there's some metadata, some information about this component that you need to know. And that information in this case is, where is my template? Template URL points to where the template is. So that's where we're going to go look for the HTML. And then the selector is, what tag do I use to put this component on a page? So this is metadata we're giving to things. Now, again, if you've done C# or Java, you may have heard this called an annotation. And they use the square brackets in some of those languages to identify them. In ECMAScript, they're actually coming out with a standard, and I believe it's at stage 3 right now for the committee, where the decorators, which is the @component, that syntax is going to be in a future version of ECMAScript. So if you're using ECMAScript 5, this won't work. So what do? Well, that's why we use things like TypeScript. We can use it today, right now, and it's going to be in the future versions of ECMAScript, And for now, TypeScript will actually compile that down to something that ECMAScript 5 can actually use. So here we're taking advantage of the tomorrow's features and using them today. All right, so what is that template that we were pointing at? Here might be that template. So the template from that last component is just a bunch of HTML and some other things. What are those other things? Well, we call this HTML plus. Why is it plus? Because there's some things there that aren't HTML. For example, you'll see these squiggly braces with name. And that's going to show you I'm data binding to the name property. Now, where's name? Let's go back for a minute. If we come back to this other model in this component, sorry about that. If we go back into the model with the component, we're going to see in this code there should be a name property. Right there, Han Solo. So we come back onto this slide, that means Han Solo should show up here. If you've done it in Angular 1, you might have done something like vm.name. You won't need to do that in Angular 2 because they've figured out, frankly, that the component is the model. It's the thing that you're going to be binding to inside your template. So any public property in your template, you're just going to go ahead and bind to. And we could also have a property called yearPublished if we wanted to. So it's HTML plus a few extra things. And those things are things like interpolation or directives, which we'll look at, or data bindings. So now we've learned about modules and components and getting our templates in. Let's take a look at how they actually fit together. We might have a file called story component. In that story component, we've got this component that we just saw. Well, he's pointing to a file that's going to be our component and one that's going to be our template. So right below there, we can say, okay, there's the story template. It should say my name is Han Solo. And that's going to have what is rendered on the screen. Well, how do I actually get this on the screen? Maybe in our index.html, I stick my story tag in there. Well, where'd that come from? That's the component, and that's where I'm going to place on my screen. I can stick that in the body. But how does that look and feel? Let's take a look at this again. What happens here is my story inside the index.html is pointing to a selector called my story up in the story component. So that's how it knows what my story is. And then that component says, based on my metadata, I think I know where that template is. It's right over here. So we can use that to associate all these together. And this is how the components and the templates fit together on the screen. And you might think about this, where every component you create just becomes an HTML tag now. So now you just stick an HTML tag wherever you need it to be, and that component will show up. That's pretty cool. And there's ways we can pass values in or pass values out as well. All right. So now that we learned about components, what about these directives I keep mentioning? Well, there's a bunch of built-in directives. There's actually a lot less than there used to be. But in these built-in directives, we need to do things sometimes that HTML just doesn't do natively. For example, if I want to show a list of 100 sessions, I don't necessarily want to copy and paste this li tag 100 times. That would really be a pain. And then reference an array and an array indexer. No, thank you. What I'd rather do is say, here's the li. This is what they should look like. Only thing that's different about them all is I want to stick a different value for each session representation in there. So here I'm using an ng4 directive. That is a special, basically, directive that Angular comes with that we can use to say, go through this list of LIs and repeat it for every instance of these sessions that you see. So when you see that star, that indicates that it's a structural or a template directive. Why? Because it's actually templatizing. It's taking like a rubber stamp around the LIs. And it's saying, I'm going to basically use that as a template to keep stamping inside of the ULs. But why the star? It's basically sugar syntax, so we don't have to write more HTML. Under the covers, it's taking care of this for us. We can also do things like style visibility and set it to a property to hide things. So in this case, we say we have the for up top, we've got the if down below. We can actually hide things as well. The if in the div is saying if there happens to be a selected session, show the details. But if it isn't there, that entire div won't even show up. It removes it from the DOM. But if you don't want to just remove it from the DOM, you just want to hide or show it, you can just set the visibility of a style. Don't worry about that syntax. We'll take a look at that next. So to recap here, the if is going to say show this template if there's a true value in here. And truth is just a term in JavaScript. Basically says if selected session has a value, show it. If not, don't bother. And then up top, we're going to iterate over all these sessions. That's my array of sessions, which should be inside of my model, my component. And then this session, the let session of sessions, that session, it becomes a local variable which I can use as the iterator. Pretty cool. All right, so we can see we got some built-in directives to do this. But what about data binding? Everybody worries about, how do I get my data on the screen? Well, we've got a DOM and we've got a component. The DOM is our UI, and the component is where our code is. We need to get data between them. And here are 4 ways we can do it. First, if we want to go from the component to the DOM, there's 2 ways to do this. We can either use interpolation or one-way binding. Interpolation is what we've seen so far with the double curly braces. That basically takes a value, a string usually, from our component and displays it read-only in the DOM. We did that with the name for Han Solo. We can also use one-way binding, so we can send values up from the component to the DOM. We can also use event binding, so when somebody interacts with the DOM, we tell the component about it. Notice all those are one-way directions. They're all unidirectional. And then there's a special way that we can do 2-way data binding, where we both tell the component to notify the DOM when a value changes and have the DOM tell the component when a value changes. Let's take a look at each one of these. First, interpolation is one way in. We might have this template that says, show the vehicle's name, its image, and its wiki link. And we can just use our interpolation to show those. It's just going to evaluate an expression, could be a function, could be a property, and it's going to display it. They will not be editable, and there's no way for the communication to go back down to the component. But this is great for read-only expressions. And every time the expression changes, it'll be reevaluated. Well, what about properties? This is where it gets wicked cool. So here, you might look at this and say, all right, we've got this syntax like source and vehicle and ng class with these square brackets around it. Those square brackets are saying these are properties of the DOM, and I want to bind them to some value in the component. Remember, this is binding a value from the component up to the DOM. So I say up top, take the vehicle's image URL, which is in my component, and whatever that happens to be, go ahead and set it to the image's source property. And you do not need to worry about using any special directives like you did in Angular 1 to do this. You can take any HTML5 property and you can bind to it. You think about that, that's really powerful because anytime HTML changes, we can bind to this. We can also do this to custom properties as well. So we just set the property to an expression and we can bind to an element if we want to, like image, or we could have like a custom element. Notice that component's called vehicle detail. There's no HTML thing called vehicle detail. That's a custom component we created, and we are allowing a vehicle property to be bound to it. We did that. And then you can also bind to directives. There's a couple of ng things, and those ng things like ng4 or ng class, they are special directives. So how do you get data up? Here's some other examples. Let's say you wanted to say, I've got an ARIA label. I want to set it to the value of OK in my model. That one doesn't actually have a property in the DOM. That one only has an attribute. And ARIA labels, ARIA is really the one thing that's kind of special like this. And for those, if there is no property in the DOM, we just say attr for attribute, dot, and then the name of the attribute, and we can bind to it. For anything else in the DOM that's a property, like a class, or maybe even adding an isStopped class to the application, we can just use a dot to bind to it. So here we're saying class.isStopped. There's a class property, and then there's a class in our CSS called isStopped, and we're going to add that to the CSS into the DOM if the value of isStopped in my component is true. If it's not, it'll be removed. And a more simple example is like color. We could set the style's color to red or blue based upon a property. So this makes it a lot easier for us to do bindings, and it also allows us to get rid of a lot of things that were in Angular 1. So all of these really give us a lot of power. So how do we do this with event binding? Event binding is I want to have a click or a changed event, and I want to call a function. Well, we use square brackets for properties, and then we're going to use the parentheses for events. So that goes back down to the component. So whenever the click expression is evaluated, we're going to call the save function. In this case, we're saying there's an element event called click, and again, this is just any valid event that's on the DOM, and then we're going to call saved. And then down here, we've got a custom event that we created on our own component called changed. Somebody changed this vehicle detail, and we want to let somebody know about it. When it's changed, we're going to call a custom function called vehicle changed. So it allows us to go in and out. And perhaps more importantly, because of all these different bindings, we can remove, I think it's like 43 different ng-directives out of Angular 1. Just disappear. There's no need for ng-show or ng-hide or ng-click or ng-blur. So if you did all that in Angular 1, they all go away. Why? Because we don't need them anymore. Now we're just using HTML. And that's really cool because there's less for you to remember, and we can just take advantage of HTML. We're writing less Angular-specific logic, and now it's just HTML. So how does two-way data binding work? Well, two-way data binding, we have a special directive called ngModel. And you can think of this as saying, I need the vehicle name to come up to the input, therefore I use the square brackets, and I also need the changes somebody types into it to go back down to the component. So I use the parentheses. So therefore, we're getting one-way direction for both of them. It's still one way, but you're putting two one-ways together, and you end up with your two-way data binding. And you can call this, it's called a banana in a box or a football in a box, but that's the syntax, which is jokingly called a football in a box. So you can say, go ahead and put the square brackets around it, put the parentheses inside, and then whatever's inside there is what you're binding to. And we use ngModel to do that two-way data binding. And ngModel, if you're familiar with Angular 1, is the same name as what we had there too. So services, that's number 6. There's a lot of shared logic we'd like to use in our applications. In Angular 1, you might have heard about a very popular Stack Overflow post called, what do I use? Do I use factories to create a service, or do I use a service? Or do I use a provider? Or do I use a constant? Or do I use a value? There were 5 ways, 5, to create a service in Angular 1. And everybody argued over it, and it was difficult to understand, and there was actually a hierarchy of how these were constructed. But you think about it, if you just wanted to share data or share some kind of functions, why do you need to remember all this? Well, Angular 2, they said, we're getting rid of all of those. All 5 of them disappeared. And instead, they're being replaced with a class. That's it. You just create a class. There's no Angular concept to learn. You just say, hey, I want to have a function that calls logger. So it's a logging service. I'll create my logger service class. And maybe I'll put a function on that called send logging information, or write error, or console. You can create anything you want with a service, and it's really not a thing of type service, it's just a class. So what does that look like? Well, we got rid of all those guys to become a class. The logic becomes very simple. In this case, I'm creating a vehicle service to go get a list of vehicles. So I just create a class. I'm exporting it so I can import it somewhere else. And I've got a function there called getVehicles. So getVehicles is just a function. It's returning some stuff. And we've got a vehicle service. Pretty easy. You don't have to worry about if it's a factory, provider, constant, whatever. So anything can be a service. Anytime you have something that provides some shareable value, you want to consider creating a class. We call them services, but they're really just a class. Shared data or logic. Most of the time it's shared logic, but you can also share data or state with a service. And in most scenarios, not all because you can customize this, but most scenarios a service will be a singleton in your application, where once it's created, like this vehicle service, I don't need 5,000 instances of it. I just want to create one instance and then go get that instance whenever I need it, so I can have lower memory footprint and then share it. Things that we might use it for is like some kind of data service like we're seeing here, or a logger, or maybe exception handling routine logic, or maybe a message sending service. So here we've got just service, and remember, I'm calling it a service, but it's just a class. Now the 7th main part is dependency injection. And this part here is really important because dependency injection, while it existed in Angular 1, it was revamped from scratch for Angular 2. And it's much more powerful. And the cool thing is you don't have to know too much to use it, which is good. Sometimes things get harder and they get harder to use. In this case, let's say we've got a component. Now, in that component, maybe it's a list of heroes. In that list of heroes, we want to get a hero service to go get my list of heroes. Well, how do I get that hero service into the component? Well, that's where I might use a constructor and to specify in the constructor what service I want to use. And then Angular can say, I got you covered. I'll inject that with dependency injection. So how does that code look? Well, right here in app component, let's say I first need to tell my application that I want to use a session service to go get a list of sessions for an event. So what I do first is I use this providers property in the metadata to say, hey, Angular. It says, yeah, John, what? I say, well, there's this session service, and other people in my application, other components, are going to want to use it. Angular says, okay, how about if I stick that inside of my injector, which is basically just a storage closet that Angular uses, and I'll hang on to that. I'm not going to create it yet, but I'll hang on to it so if somebody ever asks for a thing that's of type session service, I'll give it back to them. And I say, that's great, Angular. I'd love it if you do that. So we do that with a provider. We register a service with the Angular 2 injector by saying providers, and then we list out an array what those things are. And then Angular hangs on to that. So we're just registering it. We're not actually creating it yet. We're just telling Angular this thing exists. And you might wonder, why do I have to do that? Well, because if you don't do this and you start using a session service later, Angular and JavaScript or TypeScript are going to be like, what is that thing? You have to tell it that you wrote some custom code and that you want to use it. So we're doing it here in this case at our app component, maybe our root component. Now how do we use that? Let's say I've got a session component and I want to use that service. So what I could do is notice I've got a constructor and I'm saying go get the session service. Well, we asked that Angular 2 injector, hey Angular, goes, yeah John, do you got that session service that I told you about? It says, let me go check. And it looks and says, yep, I got it right here. And if it already has it and it's already been provided, it's going to get the same instance. If it has it and it hasn't been provided yet, hasn't been injected yet, it'll actually instantiate it and then give it to you. So by default, the way we set this up here, we're going to have one single singleton that we can share. If we didn't provide it, at this point you'd get an error message from Angular saying session service has not been provided or no provider for session service. So it's pretty obvious what you did. You forgot to, in that case, to go back one screen. And we forgot to put the provider in for session service. It's actually pretty easy to test out. Just comment that line of code out. And then go ahead back to the component here, try to inject it into a constructor, and you should get that error. So this is how we do dependency injection. And we tell Angular about these things. Now, we don't have to provide 100 times. We just provide it once. And then in 100 different components, we can inject the session service if we want to. We just need to tell the Angular injector about it one time, and then we can reuse it. So at this point, I was going to go do a live coding session, but instead, because we're short on time, if you go check out my ng-conf video, and we'll give the link out to the end of this, it's up on YouTube, or you can go to ng-conf, that's ng-conf.org, O-R-G. You can see a 20-minute quick live demo of all the concepts that we just talked about. But there's one last section I want to share with you. Tooling. When anything comes out, like Angular 2 is in RC1 right now, at the time of this recording, and it's hopefully going to be going live this year, you usually have the product comes out first, and then tooling comes out a year later or 2 years later. Well, if you think about that, that's really not good enough anymore. Why? Because we're using JavaScript and TypeScript and the web, and everything changes like on a monthly basis, it seems. Sometimes it's like a weekly basis. So we don't want to wait a year for tooling. Well, the good news is there's a lot of great tools today you can use to write this code. First, how do you save keystrokes? Well, one way I did the demo that I did is I wrote a bunch of snippets that you can grab from this hyperlink. And these snippets will let you automatically create a component on the fly and then fill in the component's name. So you don't have to remember syntax. People ask me all the time, how do you remember all this syntax? And I say, I don't. That's why I create things like this, like the snippets. And then you can use these. Well, that's great. So that helps you create little bits of code if you know what you're looking for. Well, what about my DevOps process? How do I generate a new project? How do I create the structure? How do I know what that folder structure should look like? How do I create unit tests? How do I set up Karma or Jasmine to run my unit tests? How do I build a process to build the application? How do I deploy it, maybe up to Heroku or to a cloud? And how do I do all this faster? Well, there's a tool called the CLI, Command Line Interface, and it is setting out to make it easy to do all this stuff. And it's doing a great job so far. If you check out cli.angular.io, there's a great little setup there. Let me show you a little glimpse. So the Angular CLI is supposedly going to make all this super fast and easy for us. You go to this site and you type in ng-new my dream app, like I'm doing here. It's going to pull down the application, set it up for you, call it my dream app, and then I can go into that folder and I can immediately run ng-serve. Now it's going to crank up a web server, it's going to run the application, I can go to my browser, and I can see my app instantly. And if you go look at it in Visual Studio Code, you can see the whole structure's been created. I've got unit tests, I've got end-to-end tests, I've got linting, I've got everything I need. And it's all hooking up and it works instantly. That's amazing right there. Cool. So that gets us out of the gate and running. It also gives us a uniform way to create our apps. But how do you get on the right path in the first place? What if you don't know like what the right structure is, or well, you don't know what you don't know yet? There's learning the technology, and then there's using it in a constructive way. So to get on the right path, one thing we can do is use something called the Angular 2 Style Guide. And this is something I helped put together on the Angular I/O website. It's actually now there instead of on my GitHub page. The Angular team asked us to move it over there to make it official. And it's a living document, which means it's going to be updated all the time, of conventions to use, consider, and avoid. And more importantly, every single convention that goes in there is going to tell you why you should use it. So you can make your own choice to say, I want to follow this guideline, or I don't want to follow this guideline. And based upon your choice, you'll see in the whys what those consequences are either way. For example, there's now a style vocabulary we put in, and we use a color coding scheme to say, when I write one of these styles, I say, you should do this. And do is something you should always do. It's probably a strong word, but there's usually a really good reason that you want to do this. And then there's red ones for avoid. The avoid things are things you should really never do. And again, I'll go ahead and put in there something about this is why you shouldn't do it, because if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And you can make your choice to follow these or not. But then we also added the green one, the consider. Consider are things that we're saying, this is what we prefer, but if you don't do this, that's fine. Just choose consistency over anything else. So we've got those three different levels, and they're pretty easy to spot. So in the style guide, you might see a page like this. Component selector names. You do want to use kebab case, which is the dash in there for naming. Why? Because it's going to use custom elements, and it's going to be consistent for the naming specification for elements in HTML. So therefore, they show you a reason not to do it, and an avoid, nice and red there, on how not to do this. And then some code here that actually shows how to do it. And the really cool thing with the style guide is every single example has a test behind it, which means every example has to compile and run before it actually gets put into the style guide. So anytime you press that little button over on the far right, it's going to automatically copy that code that has been tested already. You're not going to get typos, which is pretty cool. So once you use the style guide and the CLI and the snippets, how do you stay on that right path? There's a wicked cool tool by a good friend of mine, Minko Gachev, who has written CodeLyzer. Basically, this is going to check the code in your application against the style guide and then tell you which ones it's passing with and which ones it's not. And again, with this tool, you can turn rules on or off. So you could say, I really don't like this one rule in the style guide. Fine, turn it off and run your code through it. And you can hook this up to your CI process. And finally, getting back to kind of how to get into Angular 2, you can check out my course here, Angular 2 First Look, up on Pluralsight. And if you're looking for an in-person class, my buddy Dan Wallin and I are actually going to be doing a workshop in Barcelona, Spain this summer, July 31st. And you can check this out by, we'll give you a link at the end of this, or follow me on Twitter. Now at this time, I'd like to go ahead and hit the QA questions. So I'm reading through here, and I think I need to go to the bottom of the list. Let's see. We'll go backwards. Can I come to the UK? Yes, I can. They still let me in that country. I think I actually might be going to Angular Connect later this year, so that would be good, but it's not confirmed yet. How do you do mock injectable services in tests? There's actually a great cookbook inside the Angular.io docs that talks about how to do testing. And we're in the process of updating that right now, but it's very easy. It's actually easier in Angular 2 to do mocking of injectable services than it was in Angular 1. Check out those cookbooks and it'll show you that. Another gentleman's asking, what's the interface compatibility with Angular to use other libraries, like Breeze or any library in general? I guess is what he's asking. Anything. You can use anything. So any library you want to pull into Angular, you can pull in jQuery UI if you really wanted to. Anything you want to do, Breeze, Toaster. You can pull them into your application. It's just JavaScript, and it'll work with you. When will Angular 2 release be? I don't know, and if I knew, I probably couldn't say, but I honestly do not know. I made a bet a long time ago to be out in May, live. I've only got 13 days left, so not sure if that $5 bet will pay anything. But I'm guessing it's going to be this year. How easy it is to embed Angular 2 in existing C# web app? Not exactly sure what you mean there. But let's say you've got an ASP.NET app. Could you put Angular 2 in it? Yeah, absolutely. But I probably would say you want to consider, if you're building an MVC ASP.NET app and you're using the views on the server to generate code, and you're also using views to generate code on the client with Angular 2, you got to figure out what's going to be done on the client and what's going to be done on the server. So that takes a little more thinking to figure out how you architect it. But it absolutely does work. Can we use Angular 1 concepts with Angular 2? yes, hopefully you saw some of the stuff you learned in Angular 1 translates directly. The syntax doesn't always translate, which I think is fine. Syntax is scary when it changes, but give it a day or two, and believe me, you'll be fine with it. The thing that is really great, though, is that the concepts you learned in Angular 1 all translate. You will never say, at least I haven't found one yet, I could do this in Angular 1, how do I do it in Angular 2? And it's either already been done or it's in the process of coming out. For example, I used to create a directive in Angular 1. What do I do in Angular 2? Well, there's still directives in Angular 2 that you can use. It's just a component without a template. I used to create a controller in Angular 1. How to do it in Angular 2? Create a component. Could we get all these links as a summary at the end? Yes. I'm going to provide a bunch of links to Lindsay at Pluralsight, and she can perhaps get them out to everybody at the end. I've got about 20 links that were in these slides. So I'll make sure you get them out. And I'll also
we'll definitely get all those links out, John. So anyone that's awesome. Waiting or anyone that missed it, we'll get everything out.
Cool. What's the equivalent of a watch in Angular 2? Well, there's no digest cycle and there's no watching there. You can effectively, if you really want to try to solve the problem you did in Angular 1, where you were watching a value and then when that thing changed, you could actually do something with it, there's actually different change detection strategies that you can follow in Angular 2. It's a little more of an advanced topic, but it's pretty easy to follow. There's I think there's a cookbook in the dev guide of the Angular IO docs that shows you how change detection works, and you should take a look at that. Do I recommend Visual Studio Code for Angular 2? Yes, absolutely. I use that as a daily editor, and that's why I wrote the plugins for it. And in fact, the plugins that I showed here are actually in the style guide on the Angular IO site, as are some for Vim and Sublime already. And we're hoping people will contribute some for Atom and WebStorm and Visual Studio and others too. Is the CLI far enough along to use it to create production apps now? It's definitely far along enough to create the app. The building and deployment stuff is the things they're still working on. I believe they're actually beta right now. I would wait for build and deploy for them to get a little further along. But for generating your app, yeah, absolutely. You can use the CLI now. And the coolest thing is the CLI team has promised that if you use their CLI and Angular changes, like a syntax later for something, they will actually create some kind of an upgrade process to alert you when you use the CLI to say, hey, you know, you were using this syntax here, but now it's this. Would you like to change it? So it's going to be smart about that. Angular performance against React. From everything I've seen, and again, grain of salt for all the different things I've seen with it, every time I've seen Angular 2 versus React, the performance has been about neck and neck. It depends who's running the test. But this was not the case with React versus Angular 1. React was faster. But Angular 2, because it does unidirectional data flow, and it got rid of the digest cycle, and it's so much smaller, and it got rid of so much code, it's significantly faster. Can you use the Jenkins CLI? I don't know what that is. Sorry. How is routing handled in Angular 2? There's going to be a router, and it's going to be called router. And it's still being worked on right now, but most of it's been hammered out. You can try it out by looking at the docs. The routing will work for you. It's got URLs. You can do hash-based routing if you need to support older browsers. You can do child routes. You can do nested routes, parameters. There's going to be lifecycle events, so you can say, I'm leaving this page. Do you want me to or not? Or I'm coming to this page. So the router's going to have all those features in it, and most of them are there today. Then there's a link here to my talk from ngconf. Yes. And Lindsay, do we have a few more minutes?
Yeah, feel free to keep going.
Okay, so I'll talk fast to get through as many as I can. Would like to use Azure Mobile Services for Angular 2 website. How can you do it? That's kind of a big question. Probably I need to contact me on Twitter afterwards. Could John comment on SEO for Angular 2? Yes. Ooh, glad you mentioned that. Thank you, Ben. So SEO. It was a big problem with Angular 1 because everything was generated on the client, which for SEO engines, it only gets the templates. Well, we need that on the server for SEO engines. So what commonly people did in Angular 1 is they created a service called pre-render on the server to pre-render all your templates so SEO could get them. And that works. But it's an extra thing you have to set up. In Angular 2, there's something called Universal, Angular Universal. And it'll actually render your templates on the server for you. So when SEO hits them, it can actually do this. So check out Angular Universal. Template caching Angular 2 like Angular 1, does it exist? Yes, it will exist and it'll be baked into the CLI for you. When you inject a class or service, can you specify it to be a singleton or not? Yeah, there's ways you can do that. You can also create a factory if you wanted to. Just create a regular class that creates a factory to create a new instance every time as well. And you can also, if you provide a service at multiple levels, That's one way you can control which singletons are shared. Basically, it's based upon where you provide it in the component tree. Let's see here. Question on a session service. Will the ng init be called every time a component wants to use session service? Let me rephrase that. So when you saw the ng on init inside of the component, that's a lifecycle event that kicks off every time the component is created or initialized. And in there, we use that to call things like go get my data. And that's when it will go get that session service. So the question is, are we recreating the session service every time? No, we're only getting the one out of the injector, the same session service. And will it be called every time the component wants to use the session service? Let me rephrase it, not every time it uses it, but ng init will be called every time the component is created. So if you leave that screen, it's destroyed, you come back to it, it'll be called again. And there's also an ng on destroy as well, or an ng on change. When do you plan to release the first stable version of Angular? Well, I'm not releasing it, but thanks for thinking of me. It's actually probably going to be sometime this year. That's my guess. Isn't the Angular injector component hierarchical? Yes, it is hierarchical. If you have two high-level components declaring different injected components, one can't use the other unless declared. Yes, so if you create if you provide your services at multiple component levels, because it's hierarchical, when you inject one, your class is going to find the one that's closest to you. All right. Some of these are repeated. How many ways can you do bootstrapping Angular 2? There's actually one. There's no more ng-app. Now you just call a function called bootstrap. And with that bootstrap, you can basically tell it to do some logic up front to bootstrap it a different way. That's also your opportunity to say bootstrap this for mobile or bootstrap this for Electron or native script. Let's see. Can you build a module that is set more like Angular so you don't have to get the full path? Yes, 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 that's awesome. So in Angular 2, where you might have seen me in the component specifying where the template is, and I had to put a full path to the file path for it, there's actually a shortcut, which is in the style guide, and the CLI will do this for you, where you don't have to tell it, go to this folder, that subfolder, this third subfolder, / my file name. You just tell it the file name, and as long as it's in the same folder that your component's in, it'll find it, which is really great if you're moving files around so you don't get typos. Do I recommend TypeScript? Yes. For writing Angular code? Yes. Or is JavaScript just as effective? ES5, it's more painful, quite frankly. And it's not just ES5, even though I love ES5, it's the tooling, because there's so many opportunities to make mistakes. If you wanted to do Angular 2, I would highly recommend ES6 with Babel or TypeScript, one of the two. And quite frankly, they're both pretty big departures from ES5. So yes, you can use ES6 if you want to. How would you migrate from Angular 1 to Angular 2? If you need to run Angular 1 and Angular 2 together, you can with something called ng-upgrade. If you want to upgrade your app from Angular 1 to Angular 2, there's a couple tools that, like ng-forward, that's a community project that you can use. And if you have a long-term strategy, you're probably best off trying to figure out how do I actually rewrite it in Angular 2, like anything. But there's definitely ways you can actually run both Angular 1 and Angular 2 in the same app with ng-upgrade. A couple repeated questions, and I'll answer two more. Let's see here. How do we call a class function from a function in another class? Oh, all you would do in that case, you have like two classes, maybe they're different services in different files. You would just say, okay, import the class from the other file, and when you import that, you get a reference to the variable. You can then use dependency injection to inject it in your constructor, and you just call that function, just like we did with the component example to call the other service. And let's go one last question, because I like this one, from Simon, ng4, star ng4. There's a meaning of a hash versus let. So this was one breaking change they did about 2 weeks ago. They used to, in the ng4 syntax, use the hash sign to designate the variable, the iterator. So we would say ng4 equals hash session of sessions. Now we say ng4 equals let session of sessions. And I actually wrote a blog post about this if you go to johnpapa.net on why they made this change and kind of what were the thought processes behind it. Because they try not to do breaking changes, but they felt very strongly about it. And once you learn about what's there, and if you read that blog post at johnpapa.net, you'll see that. Cool. There are about 500 other questions here. I don't think I'll get to them all, but I'd be happy to answer any on Twitter, and you can continue that conversation with me there if you'd like. I'll hand it back to you, Lindsay.
All right, awesome, John. We actually had a couple questions come in on Twitter, and it sounds like you answered them as well here. So that's a good point you brought up. If you have additional questions and we have additional content come through, like the recording of this webinar, we will share it on Twitter. Continue the conversation there. Tag your questions with hashtag Pluralsight Live. Again, thank you everyone for your patience. Sorry about the bumpy start and the technical difficulties. John, thank you so much for being prepared and having the backup slides. We're so sorry we weren't able to do the live demo, but we will share the recording of your live demo from NGConf with everyone, as well as the recording of today's presentation. Give us just a little bit of turnaround time for that. And again, everyone, have a wonderful day. And I'm also disappointed to learn that you're not the one releasing Angular 2, John, but, you know.
If it was up to me, it'd be out right now.
So thank you so much. And if you have any final thoughts for everyone today?
No, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for coming. I appreciate you sticking around, and I'm definitely around all the time on Twitter answering questions. And I hope to see you at some conference in the future with either myself or my buddy Dan Walleen.
Great. Looking forward to the new courses coming out and everything else. So have a wonderful day, everyone. John, thank you once again. Thank you, everyone.